In our topic about ancient China, we are now going to look at the Terracotta Army. And I'd like to share this amazing book with you, which is called Vincent's Starry Night and Other Stories. And this is a big collection of short stories which tell us more about the lives and the work of some great artists over history, over thousands and thousands of years of history. So you can probably guess which Vincent we're referring to on the front there. And if we go to page 43, then we have a story which will tell us more about the craftspeople who constructed the Terracotta Army, because it was all made by hand. So you can see here on this side we've got a really nice photo of the Terracotta Army, some of it. Okay, I don't think you'll be able to see the words, but I will read it to you anyway. So, the Warrior Factory. Qin Shi Huang's craftsmen. Foreman Yang could not explain the sinking feeling in his heart. It should have been a day to celebrate. This morning, the superintendent of works had been present to watch Yang put the finishing touches to the last of the clay warriors. It was 10 years since the first life-size warrior left his workshop to be fired in the kiln. Since then, Jiang and his team had made more than 100. Each tiny detail had to be perfect. The overlapping platelets of armour, the chin straps, the boot ties. You were expected to model every statue as though it was your life's work. Then you had to do the same thing again and again. Jiang's team was one of 70 teams, whose job was to produce a whole army of clay warriors. The fires in the kilns never stopped burning. The warriors marched out, hardened into terracotta. Painted and armed with real weapons, more than 7,000 of them would guard the tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang. The emperor's mighty armies had conquered all the neighbouring kingdoms to create the great empire of Qin, or China. As a result, he had many enemies. The terracotta warriors would protect his dead body, repulsing the attacks of vengeful spirits. Even after he was dead, the emperor would rule an underground empire. He would have a vast palace peopled with terracotta courtiers and entertainers, pleasure gardens and canals flowing with mercury instead of water. Some said that the emperor got the idea of making life-size statues from travellers returning from the far west, where they'd seen bronze statues of a famous Greek king called Alexander the Great. Jiang was modest, but he was proud of his team. They had made hardly any mistakes. Only one statue had shattered in the kiln. No one had been put to death for shoddy craftsmanship. The emperor will reward you, the superintendent smiled. Jiang didn't trust him. It was the smile of a man who no longer has a use for you. For years, the superintendent had sent other foremen to learn from the way Jiang modelled the soldiers' faces. An assistant would bring him a hollow head that had been made from yellow clay in a mould. Onto this, Jiang added layers of finer clay, silky and smooth. With quick strokes of a wooden scraper or his thumb, he formed the arched eyebrows, the elegant moustaches and beards, and all the other features that make one face different from another. The clay came alive in his hands. Usually, Jiang had to imagine the soldiers' faces, but sometimes an officer came to his workshop to have his real-life portrait modelled. Jiang didn't mind the way the officer's haughty eyes looked straight through him, as if he did not exist. While they posed, he studied their expressions carefully, and not all the officers were snooty. Recently, one of them had chatted with him in a very friendly way about his home village and young men, and his wife and young son. This afternoon, Jiang heard unfamiliar sounds in the courtyard outside the workshops. Soldiers were giving orders. Your work here is finished. Pack up. Get ready to leave. He supposed that the soldiers were just doing as they had been told. Still, it did not feel like much of a reward. Aha! I have found you, Foreman Jiang. The voice made Jiang jump. But it was only the friendly officer from Young Men. I've been looking everywhere for you. Here. The officer reached inside his tunic and drew out a small parcel, wrapped in a scrap of silk. I told my wife about the wonderful portrait you made of me. She sent you this. What do you think? Jiang unwrapped the parcel. It contained a little clay figure of a soldier, obviously the work of the officer's young son. The face was like a small flat cake, with nose, mouth and eyes crudely drawn. The armour was made by criss-cross scratches. Outside, a soldier yelled, "You must all assemble outside the superintendent's office at dawn tomorrow." "What is happening?" asked Jiang anxiously. The officer glanced over his shoulder. His voice dropped to a whisper. "The Emperor has decreed that you craftsmen must keep the warrior's company in his tomb. Take my advice. Go as far away as you can, quickly, before sunrise." When it was dark, Foreman Jiang packed his wooden scrapers and a few other belongings and slipped out of the workshop. He walked until he was far from the Emperor's tomb. Behind him, he could still see the lights of the kilns and the workmen's huts. He thought of the deep, long pits where thousands of terracotta soldiers stared fiercely into the night. Pulling his cloak around him, he hurried on. That's the end of the story. I don't think I fancy being one of the people making the terracotta soldiers. I don't know about you. And then at the end having to be in the tomb as well. Bit scary. Okay, thanks for listening.